Imagine having the most valuable product on Earth. A product so embedded in human culture that it literally reshaped how the world celebrates Christmas. A product drunk by soldiers in World War II on every continent. A product that NASA brought to space on the shuttle. A product so powerful that when people in other countries wanted to describe America, they didn't say freedom or democracy. They said Coca-Cola. Now imagine taking that product, that century-old icon, that irreplaceable piece of global identity, and throwing it in the trash. Not because it was failing, not because it was broken, not because the world was begging you to change it, but because a bunch of suits in a boardroom got scared, because a rival company ran a few taste tests in shopping malls, because one man's ego simply could not stand the idea of losing. On April 23, 1985, the Coca-Cola Company announced something that sent shockwaves through the entire world. They were changing the formula for the world's most popular soft drink. For the first time in 99 years. Gone. The original was being killed, replaced by something they were calling New Coke. The backlash was so violent, so visceral, so completely unprecedented in the history of American business that the term New Coke didn't just become a punchline. It became a permanent entry in the English language, a synonym for catastrophic, self-inflicted failure. People hoarded cases of the original. A man in San Antonio drove to a local bottler and spent $1,000 buying up every bottle he could find. Fidel Castro, the communist dictator of Cuba, publicly denounced New Coke as a sign of American decay. Protest groups formed overnight. Senators got involved. The CEO of Coca-Cola received a letter addressed to, and I quote, Chief Dodo, the Coca-Cola Company. Another letter asked Goizueta for his autograph because, the writer said, the signature of one of the dumbest executives in American business history would one day be worth a fortune. This is the story of how the most dominant brand in the history of capitalism nearly committed suicide. How one man's obsession with winning a taste test almost destroyed 100 years of legacy in 79 days. And how, somehow, this disaster ended up becoming one of the greatest accidental marketing coups of all time. But to understand how they made a blunder this historic, we have to go back to the very beginning. Let's be real about what Coca-Cola actually was. Because people like to romanticize it. They like to talk about the secret formula locked in a vault in Atlanta, the mysterious ingredients, the century of tradition. But strip all that away and you know what Coca-Cola is? Sugar, water, caramel coloring, and the kind of brand loyalty that makes people physically angry if you touch it. Coca-Cola dated back to 1886, when a pharmacist in Columbus, Georgia invented the drink and began selling it to soda fountains. The original formula, by the way, contained small amounts of cocaine until 1929. So if you ever wondered why people seemed absolutely addicted to it, yeah, that's not a metaphor. By the mid-20th century, Coke wasn't just a drink, it was America in a bottle. In the 1930s, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist described it as the sublimated essence of all America stands for, a decent thing, honestly made. Nobody blinked when the company hung a sign for the Apollo 11 astronauts reading, "Welcome back to Earth, home of Coca-Cola." This thing was untouchable, unkillable. During World War II, the US military built 64 bottling plants overseas just to make sure soldiers could drink Coke on the front lines. But then came the 1970s. And with the 1970s came Pepsi. And Pepsi had a plan. Prior to the Pepsi Generation campaign, Coke outsold Pepsi in the US by a staggering 6-to-1 ratio. 6-to-1! Pepsi was barely a competitor. They were a footnote, a punchline, the soda you got when the restaurant was out of Coke. But Pepsi was hungry, and hungry companies do dangerous things. In 1963, Pepsi launched the Pepsi Generation campaign. They didn't compete on taste, they competed on identity. Young, cool, rebellious, not your parents' drink. And slowly, steadily, it started to work. By 1975, Coke was selling 1.1 billion cases annually in the US, while Pepsi had surged to 775 million. That gap, which used to be oceanic, was shrinking fast. Then Pepsi did something genuinely brilliant and genuinely evil. In 1975, Pepsi launched the Pepsi Challenge. People were asked which cola they preferred in blind taste tests. The campaign suggested consumers favored Pepsi over Coca-Cola based solely on taste. Pepsi set up booths in malls across America. Ordinary people filmed on camera taking two unmarked cups, Cup M, Cup Q. Pick your favorite. And again and again and again, they picked Pepsi. The Pepsi Challenge wasn't just a marketing gimmick. Consistently, and even when tested in a controlled environment, Pepsi would be preferred about 57% of the time. Now here's where it gets truly ugly for Coca-Cola. Internal studies at Coca-Cola confirmed what the Pepsi Challenge was showing. If you just look at the taste of the beverage, consumers preferred Pepsi. Think about that for a second. The world's #1 brand, the drink that defined American identity for a century, and even their own private tests were telling them people like Pepsi more. In supermarket sales, where consumers had the freedom to choose, Pepsi had actually overtaken Coke. The panic inside the Coca-Cola boardroom was real. And pacing that boardroom, chain cigarette in hand, steel blue eyes scanning the horizon, was the man who would make the biggest mistake in corporate history: Roberto Goizueta. Roberto Crispulo Goizueta was born in 1931 in Havana, Cuba, into an aristocratic family with interests in the sugar industry. He studied chemical engineering at Yale, returned to Cuba, and answered a newspaper job listing for a position at the local Coca-Cola bottler. He spent years climbing, surviving, maneuvering. After Fidel Castro nationalized Coca-Cola's Cuban operations, Goizueta and his family defected to the United States with little more than $40 and 100 shares of Coca-Cola stock. That experience, losing everything overnight, having to rebuild from absolute zero in a foreign country, it made him relentless, calculating, obsessed with control. He was willing to lie about his background to make himself look better. He claimed he knew no English when he fled Cuba, but in reality, he had been the best English student in his high school class. He had an inability to work with people he could not control. He was brilliant, but ice cold. The kind of leader that inspires respect, but not love. People referred to him as the brain of Coca-Cola, and while that pleased him, there was a part of him that coveted his co-executive Donald Kehoe's ability to win the affection and personal loyalty of ordinary employees. By 1981, Goizueta was chairman and CEO, and he arrived at the top with a very specific vision. He told managers there were no sacred cows in the Coke organization and that nobody should feel safe. No sacred cows. He would soon prove he meant it. To his credit, Goizueta made some genuinely brilliant moves. In 1982, he introduced Diet Coke, departing from the company's unwritten rule of never tagging a product with the Coke trademark. Diet Coke became the most successful consumer product launch of the 1980s. He spent $692 million to acquire a share of Columbia Pictures in 1982. When he sold the studio in 1989, the company netted $1.5 billion. The man could make money. He could build brands. He increased Coca-Cola's market value from $4 billion in 1981 to over $150 billion during his tenure. But success is dangerous, because when someone goes on a winning streak long enough, they stop believing they can be wrong. They stop listening to the people around them. They start to believe the data in their spreadsheets is more real than the emotions of the human beings buying their product. And in 1984 and 1985, Roberto Goizueta was a man who had been winning for long enough he had genuinely forgotten how it felt to lose. Pepsi had a new weapon too. They had signed Michael Jackson, the biggest star on the planet. The The Thriller album had just sold 40 million copies, and Pepsi was using Michael to tell the world, this is the drink of your generation. Not Coke, not that old thing your parents drank. Pepsi. Coca-Cola's market share was declining. Part of the problem with the success of the Pepsi challenge was that Coke had fallen into a malaise as a brand. People were in love with the notion of Coca-Cola, but they weren't necessarily drinking Coca-Cola. And that distinction, loving a brand versus actually buying it, would prove to be the critical thing that everyone at Coca-Cola completely failed to understand. A secret project was launched. Codename Project Kansas. Here's the thing about Project Kansas. It wasn't reckless or impulsive. That would almost be forgivable. No. What makes this story truly spectacular is that Coca-Cola was incredibly careful, incredibly methodical, and incredibly wrong in a way that $4 million worth of research simply couldn't save them from. While the company was developing the unique formula for Diet Coke in 1982, it found in top-secret taste tests that a sweeter version of the concoction beat not only Pepsi, but the classic version of Coke. That was the spark. That was the moment someone in a lab looked at the numbers and thought, what if we just changed it? What if we stopped being what we are and started being what people say they want? The project was kept completely secret. Goizueta's team spent years refining a new formula, sweeter, smoother, more like Pepsi, without admitting it was more like Pepsi. The company spent $4 million on taste tests with 200,000 consumers who favored the new, smoother and sweeter formula over both old Coke and Pepsi. 200,000 people, $4 million. The data was overwhelming. And here's what makes this a genuinely Greek tragedy. The tests weren't fake. People really did prefer the taste of new Coke in sip tests. That part was real. The science was sound. But the question they never asked, the question that would have saved them from all of this, was simple. How would you feel if we replaced the original forever? Never did the market research testers ask subjects how they would feel if the new formula replaced the old one. They tested taste. They didn't test identity. They didn't test memory. They didn't test the 99-year-old emotional contract between Coca-Cola and the people who had grown up drinking it at baseball games, at diners, at their grandparents' kitchen table, on Christmas morning. There was another catastrophic decision made during this period that almost nobody talks about. Coca-Cola first considered selling both the old and new Coke, but they decided not to because of concerns from bottlers and stores. Bottlers wouldn't want the hassle of making two different products, and stores wouldn't want to use their limited space to stock both versions. So they didn't just create a new product, they killed the original, permanently, or so they announced. And critically, the bottlers, who knew their local customers better than any executive in Atlanta ever could, were never consulted about whether this was a good idea. They were simply told what was happening from on high. On April 23, 1985, Roberto Goizueta walked into a press conference at Lincoln Center in New York City. Cameras everywhere, journalists packed in, the whole world watching. And he announced the death of the original Coca-Cola. He declared the new formula to be smoother, rounder, yet bolder, a more harmonious flavor. When asked to describe exactly what it tasted like, Goizueta stumbled on camera. Smoother? Rounder, yet bolder, he said. Not exactly the rallying cry of a man who fully believed what he was doing. The press said what Goizueta couldn't admit. New Coke tasted sweeter and more like Pepsi. PepsiCo's CEO Roger Enrico watched all this and immediately ran a full-page ad in newspapers across the country, declaring victory in the Cola Wars. He gave his employees a day off to celebrate. These two products, Pepsi and Coke, have been going at it eyeball to eyeball, and in my view, the other guy just blinked, Enrico said. And Coke had blinked catastrophically. What happened next was something no market research on Earth could have predicted, something that proved once and for all that human beings do not buy products, they buy meaning, they buy memory, they buy identity. And when you strip that away, when you actually take the thing that has been woven into the fabric of their lives for generations, people don't just complain, they go to war. The phones started ringing within hours. Calls flooded Coca-Cola's offices. By June 1985, the company was still receiving 1,500 calls a day, 4 times more than usual. People didn't just call to complain, they called to grieve. Actual grief, like someone had died, because to them, something had. According to Coca-Cola itself, many people panicked or got depressed. Cases of original Coke began disappearing from shelves, not because Coca-Cola pulled them, but because people were hoarding them. A man in San Antonio, Texas, drove to a local bottler and spent $1,000 buying up every bottle of original Coke he could get his hands on. People were filling their basements. Some had 900 bottles stacked floor to ceiling. And then the protests started. Songs were written to honor the old taste. Protesters at a Coca-Cola event in downtown Atlanta in May 1985 carried signs reading, "We want the real thing," and "Our children will never know refreshment." Think about that sign for a second. Our children will never know refreshment over a soda. This was not a rational response, and that was entirely the point. Rationality had nothing to do with it. Groups like the Society for the Preservation of the Real Thing and the Old Cola Drinkers of America, which claimed 100,000 members, formed to demand the return of the original Coke. The leader of Old Cola Drinkers of America was a man named Gay Mullins. He wasn't a political organizer, he wasn't a celebrity, he was just an ordinary American who was absolutely furious. He spent $30,000 of his own money and 3 weeks of his time fighting to bring back the original formula. In Seattle, Mullins' group actually set up a protest hotline. In California, people collected signatures. One Seattle consumer even filed a suit against the company to force it to provide the old drink. At protests staged by grassroots groups, consumers poured the contents of new Coke bottles into sewer drains. They were literally pouring it into the gutter, on camera. A poll showed that only 13% of soda drinkers liked new Coke. 13%! Pepsi ran a devastating commercial. A young girl addresses the camera directly. "Somebody out there tell me why Coke did it. Why did Coke change?" Then she tries her first Pepsi, and the voiceover declares that Pepsi is the choice of a new generation. It was brilliant, ruthless, and completely earned. Inside Coca-Cola's Atlanta headquarters, the atmosphere was somewhere between a war room and a funeral home. Executives who had been celebrated as visionaries 2 months earlier were now being treated like war criminals by their own neighbors. People held any Coca-Cola employee, from security officers at headquarters to their neighbors who worked for Coke, personally responsible for the change. Roberto Goizueta received the now infamous letter addressed to Chief Dodo, the Coca-Cola company. He often said he was more upset that it actually was delivered to him. Another letter demanded his autograph because the signature of one of the dumbest executives in American history would be worth a fortune. Members of Congress started calling. United States senators were getting constituent mail about a soda drink. The story led network news broadcasts. The op-ed pages of every major newspaper in the country were consumed with outrage. CBS News reporter Bob Simon described it as the people against the corporation, only in America. And here is the most extraordinary part of all of this. Fidel Castro, the man who had driven Goizueta's family out of Cuba, the communist dictator who had nationalized their business and sent them fleeing to America with $40 and 100 shares of Coca-Cola stock, even Fidel Castro weighed in, denouncing new Coke as a sign of American decay. When your greatest enemy agrees with your protesters, you know you've done something genuinely historic. The boardroom was cracking. Week after week, the calls kept coming, the letters kept piling up. The company was getting 1,500 calls on its consumer hotline by June 1985, compared to 400 before. The PR team was drowning. The marketing team had no answer. And Roberto Goizueta, the brilliant, calculating, ice-cold strategist who bet a century of brand equity on a taste test, was sitting in his 25th floor office watching a summer storm over Atlanta, wondering how this had happened. He had the data, he had the numbers, he had done everything right. And somehow, everything had gone catastrophically wrong. Because data can measure what a tongue prefers in a 5-second sip test, data cannot measure what a human heart will refuse to give up. 79 days after launching New Coke, the surrender was announced. On July 11, 1985, Coca-Cola president Donald Keogh stood before the cameras, the same cameras that had watched this disaster unfold in real time, and delivered what may be the greatest corporate mea culpa in American history. "We're not that dumb, and we're not that smart," Keogh said, acknowledging they had clearly misread the public's connection to the original drink. The simple fact is that all the time and money and skill poured into consumer research on the new Coca-Cola could not measure or reveal the deep and abiding emotional attachment to original Coca-Cola felt by so many people, Keogh admitted. The original formula, barely 79 days on the shelf, was coming back, rebranded as Coca-Cola Classic. The story that old Coca-Cola was returning led 2 network newscasts and made the front page of virtually every major newspaper in the country. And now, here comes the truly insane part of this story, the part that makes you question everything. So what actually happened after Coca-Cola surrendered? You'd expect the story to end there. Coca-Cola humiliated, Pepsi triumphant, the natural order restored after a brief and embarrassing interlude of corporate madness. But that's not what happened. People were excited about the return of Coca-Cola Classic and began buying more Coke as a result. People all of a sudden wanted to actually taste the beverage again.
Think about what just occurred. Coca-Cola, by threatening to take away the original, made America fall in love with it all over again. The crisis reinvigorated the brand, driving a massive sales surge for Classic Coke and reinforcing its market dominance. Coca-Cola Classic quickly outsold New Coke, and within a few months had returned to its position as the top-selling sugar cola, ahead of Pepsi. Pepsi's moment of victory, their triumphant "We won the Cola Wars" declaration, lasted about 4 months. Then Coke came roaring back harder than ever. And the conspiracy theories started almost immediately. Some cynics say that we planned the whole thing, Keogh admitted. The truth is, we are not that smart. Was it a plan? Was it genius disguised as stupidity? Did Coca-Cola intentionally create a crisis to engineer the greatest nostalgia marketing campaign in history? The Coca-Cola Company has always denied it. The fact-checking website Snopes considers the conspiracy theory false, asserting that the company's mistake was simply prioritizing taste test results over the original Coke's legacy. But the outcome was so perfect, so precise, that the conspiracy theory never died. And honestly, it doesn't matter whether it was planned. What matters is what it revealed. New Coke was renamed Coke 2 in 1992. It was discontinued in 2002 due to minuscule market share, a complete ghost, as if it had never existed. Except it had existed, and it had changed everything. During Guizetta's 16-year leadership, he increased Coca-Cola's market value from $4 billion in 1981 to roughly $150 billion at the time of his death. He became one of the most successful CEOs in corporate history. The man who sent out a product that got called the marketing blunder of the century ended up being remembered as a visionary. Roberto Guizetta died on October 18, 1997, of lung cancer. He was 66 years old. The chain-smoking Cuban immigrant who had fled to America with $40 and rebuilt himself into the leader of the world's most valuable brand. His estimated wealth was $1.3 billion at the time of his death, making him the richest Hispanic in the United States. At the 10-year anniversary celebration of New Coke in 1995, Guizetta didn't apologize. He reframed the entire disaster as a case study in intelligent risk-taking. "We set out to change the dynamics of sugar colas in the United States, and we did exactly that, albeit not in the way we had planned," he said. That is a staggering act of psychological re-engineering. The man who wrote "No sacred cows" on a whiteboard and then killed the most sacred cow in American consumer history somehow convinced himself and his shareholders that it had all been worth it. And in a brutal, ironic way, Maybe it was. But here's what actually keeps me up at night about this story. Here's the thing that matters beyond the soda, beyond the taste tests, beyond the boardroom panic and the protest signs, and the man who spent $1,000 hoarding bottles in San Antonio. Coca-Cola's executives were not stupid. Roberto Guizeta was not stupid. These were some of the smartest people in American business, surrounded by the best market research money could buy, making decisions they genuinely believed were correct. And they were completely, catastrophically, historically wrong. Because they confused data with truth. They confused a sip test with a soul. They confused what people said they wanted with what people actually needed. They didn't understand that a brand is not a product. A brand is a promise. It's a shared story between a company and the people who have made it part of their lives. And when you break that promise, even with the best intentions, even with $4 million worth of research backing you up, people don't just get annoyed. They feel betrayed. They feel like you've reached into their memory and erased something. And no amount of data, no spreadsheet, no quarterly earnings report will ever tell you that's coming. Because no survey in the world can measure the weight of a Sunday afternoon at your grandfather's house, the sound of a bottle cap popping off a glass bottle on a summer day, the specific, unreplicable feeling of drinking something that has been part of your life for as long as you can remember. That's what Coca-Cola tried to replace with a sweeter formula. That's what 200,000 taste tests completely failed to detect. And that is why 40 years later, every business school in the world still teaches this story, not as a cautionary tale about market research, not as a lesson in consumer behavior, but as a warning about arrogance. The arrogance of believing that because you understand a market, you understand the people in it. The arrogance of believing that numbers can replace human intuition. The arrogance of walking into a press conference at Lincoln Center and announcing to the world that you were about to improve on something that didn't need improving. The Cola Wars didn't destroy Coca-Cola. Roberto Guizeta's ego almost did. And the most damning part, the most truly cynical part of this entire saga, Coca-Cola survived. They didn't just survive, they thrived. As of 2019, Coca-Cola commanded 43.7% of the carbonated soft drink market, while PepsiCo commanded 24.1%. Pepsi, the brand that won every taste test, that had Michael Jackson, that declared victory in the Cola Wars, is now a distant second. The company that committed what was universally called the marketing blunder of the century somehow came out the other side stronger, which tells you something deeply uncomfortable about the world we live in. In business, it turns out you don't have to be right. You just have to be unforgettable. And nothing makes you unforgettable quite like making a mistake so colossal, so public, so breathtakingly stupid that it becomes permanently woven into the fabric of American culture. Coca-Cola didn't win the Cola Wars by being better. They won by being so catastrophically wrong that the entire country rallied to defend them. That's not genius. That's not strategy. That's dumb luck wearing a business suit, carrying a briefcase full of taste test data, walking into history by accident. And somewhere in a boardroom in Atlanta, someone is probably looking at a spreadsheet right now, absolutely convinced they've figured out the next bold move. Absolutely convinced the data is telling them the truth. Absolutely convinced they cannot lose. Sound familiar?